Hey guys, Matthew, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Get Rich Quick series. Now, quick disclaimer, this series is all about league start scenario and giving you guys methods to get a head start on the competition when it comes to farming currency. Now, every method is going to have some upsides and some downsides. One of the biggest downsides of this method is that potentially it might not even be viable in the future, because we do know that they are condensing the 8 regions of the Atlas into 4 zones. Now, technically, this is a good thing. But one question that remains is, what happens to the Atlas passives? Are they all going to be put into like the same tree? So are they going to be merging different trees together so we have access to all the different passives? Are they going to be alternating between leagues which passive we're going to get? I have no idea. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. So there's a chance that because this utilizes the passive tree that is currently in Lexajoris, that this method completely dies out in the future. Something that to let you guys know about. Of course, you would know that in the patch notes prior to the league even starting. All right, next, one of the other downside of this method is that you need to be pretty good at the game, pretty fast at the game, and you need to play a meta build in order to take advantage of it. All right, because this is one of these strategies that require you to progress your Atlas at a decent pace, because if you get there at the end of the first week, you know, it's already gone. You want to get there pretty quick. So this is another thing that is going to be important. One of the greatest upsides, however, is that it goes hand in hand with your progression of the Atlas, right? Because you're going to require some of these different passes on the Atlas, it does require you to go through the Atlas and, you know, complete all your different maps and all that, you know, work on your Atlas bonus, work on the Maven quest line, work on the Sirus quest line, right? It requires you to actually do all this stuff, which means that you're not gimping your progress in terms of, levels or completion in any way. Another thing that's really good about this is that if you're playing any build, literally any build that is a meta, decent, clear build, you are going to be able to do this strategy because it doesn't require too much in terms of the actual build. We'll talk about which builds can do that later on. A friend of mine helped me test this. Huge shout out to him. I'll be introducing him later on in the video. But what I want to talk about today is cluster jewel farming. But I'm not talking about the regular rare cluster jewels that you guys are farming, right? The mediums, those are the big money. I'm talking actually about farming small, unique cluster jewels. These guys are really big money in a league start scenario. Matter of fact, I believe there are 7 of them, and we did the math on them, and every single time that you drop one of these cluster jewels, you are making 50 to 55 chaos on average in a league start scenario, right? This does not mean that they're all worth that much. There's going to be some that are much lower and some that are much higher. But on average, every time you drop a rare or a unique small cluster jewel, you're making over 50C, which in a league start scenario is somewhere around half an exalt. All right, so let's have a look at the different ones. The Siege is one of the obviously cheaper ones, right? Calamicious Vision is one that is actually pretty decent. When you get this, you basically drop just about an exalt in a league start scenario. Now, one thing to note is that PoE Ninja data is a little bit late, which means the first date that we have here available is 25th, and I believe the league started on 22nd or 23rd, if I remember correctly, which means that there is a bit of a delay in the data, which means that in a league start scenario, these would be even more expensive potentially. All right, next we have the front line. As you can see, a very cheap one. Natural Affinity, also a pretty cheap one. The Interrogation started off pretty expensive. Also seeing a massive resurge around now because Secrets of Suffering is, becoming very popular, right? But very good at the league start scenario. One with nothing, one of the best ones because everybody's interested. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people are interested in Hollow Palm, leveling with it, making league starters around it. It is a single jewel that enables an entire build, an entire archetype, really. So it's pretty expensive. And then we also have Kitava's Teaching, which is typically the best one. Disciple of Kitava is an amazing notable. If you don't know what Disciple of Kitava is, basically it gives you that every second you consume a nearby corpse to recover 5% mana and life, right? So the thing is, this recover is basically instant, right? It's not a regen, it's not a leech, it is an instant recovery, which means it is really strong for builds that utilize Desecrate, which are typically very popular in a league start scenario, which is why we are seeing some pretty good price on Kitava's Teachings. Works for things like General Cry, works for things like the Soul Rest build, stuff like that, right? Anything that uses Desecrate is going to love Kitava's Teachings. All right, now let's talk about the actual numbers and results from testing this strategy because we've tested it pretty good amount. What we're going to want to do, and the way that we're going to set this up is we're going to head over to Lexajoris. Now, I don't know if the skill tree is still going to be there. in Lexajoris, but hopefully it's still on the Atlas anywhere possible. The only node that we actually care about is Persecutory Delusions, right? It's cool to get time and again because it helps you, sustain your Alva missions, which is decent for later on in the game. I wouldn't waste my Atlas missions, my Alva missions in this specific strategy because it's not going to be super high in content. Pathological is going to be necessary to get to Persecutory Delusions, and Compulsive Hoarder is honestly nothing to write home about, as it doesn't really scale. It's always just a flat 10%, which means once every 10 maps, right, you are going to generate 3 additional rewards, which means that on average, you're not even getting 1 extra reward per map. 1 extra bar of loot, which is completely random. That could be complete trash, right? Things like armor, for example, obviously not going to be great. Weapons, jewelry, etc. So it doesn't have a whole lot of value. What we are interested in is Persecutory Delusions, because Delirium encounters and areas have 100% more likely to spawn a unique boss. So if you don't know how unique bosses work in Delirium, every 20% Delirium is essentially 20% chance to spawn a boss, right? So if you have 1 Delirium orb, you have a 20% chance to spawn a boss. If you have this, you therefore have a 40% chance to spawn a boss. Meaning if you go to 40% Delirium, you have an 80%, 60% Delirium, you have a 120% chance, which means at 60% Delirious, that's basically your magic number. You are going to get double bosses every single map. At 40%, you have an 80% chance to get each of the bosses. It is individual, right? It's not an 80% to get 1 or 0 or both. They're treated individually, but you have an 80% chance to get each of the bosses, which means on average, you're getting at least 1 boss per map, almost close to 2 bosses per map, even on 40%. I'll talk about 40% versus 60% in a second here. Next, you have Delirium bosses and areas drop 100% increase Simulacrum Splinters. I'll talk about that in the numbers, how much that means. But basically, in red maps, with 40% to 60% Delirium, the bosses drop about 20 Splinters each, which is pretty massive considering every time you get 2 bosses in a map, that's 40 Splinters that you're walking away with for very, very little investment. Next, Delirium bosses and areas have a 100% increased chance to drop unique cluster jewels. I'll talk about how much that actually equates to in the real world, but that is basically double the chance to drop cluster jewels, which is absolutely insane. This is essentially what we are going to be focusing on. On top of that, we also have a chance, Delirium monsters have a chance to drop increased cluster jewels. Now, this cannot be the unique cluster jewels, but it can be obviously rare ones like mediums, which can be worth quite a bit. And because we are going to be focused on T11 maps for the strategy, I'll talk about that in a second. This means that we are getting, pretty much a very good in-between of the item level of the clusters that people typically care for on mediums and on larges, which is typally 75. There's only a few different clusters that are going to gain value over that, which is typically going to be the next threshold of level 84. But that's not really possible unless you're farming like T17 maps, so we don't really look at that. We're mostly focused on the 75 as our magic number for value of clusters, and because we're running T11s, this is easily done. All right, now let's talk about what the numbers equate to, because we know that, since I've said it earlier, these different unique clusters have a value of about 50 to 55 C each. Every time you drop one of them in a map, in a League Start scenario, well, how much is that worth, right? How many of these are you actually going to get? And of course, what builds can do this. So before I say anything else, I do want to say a huge, massive shout out to Fyregrass. I highly recommend you check out his channel. He's probably actually going to be making build guides for different builds that can run this strategy to around the start of next league once we know whether it's doable or not. He's the person who helped me test this out pretty extensively, and we are super, super happy with the result. And honestly, this is looking like an amazing League Start strategy for people who like pushing pretty hard. Note that this is something that will work out for the first 4 or 5 days of League, and then it's drastically going to start decreasing as these, cluster jewels are more and more widely available, as you saw in the different prices. Obviously, Kitava's teachings was a bit of different one this league because there was many builds that popped out that needed it. But as you can see, obviously, it's starting to drop pretty considerably. All right, so now let's look at the data. So 40% or 60% is going to be up to you. I would probably say that in a League Start scenario, 40% is going to be better, because at 40%, pretty much any build is going to be able to do a T11, 40% Delirious Maps. It's basically the equivalent of T15, T16. If your build can farm that, it can farm 40% Deli T11s. That being said, when it comes to 60%, there's a pretty dramatic jump, and at 60% deli map, even a T11 is drastically harder than a regular T16 map, so the jump is pretty considerable. Now, of course, if you're able to farm these, they're going to be worth it a lot more so, but you need to be able to farm them at the same speed. I'll talk about, the difference in a second here. Okay, so any T11 maps with 2 or 3 random deli orbs, depending if you're going for 40 or 60. Now, in a League Start scenario, the cheapest deli orbs are between 5 and 10C. It kind of depends on the meta. Now, there are divination cards that came out for Delirium orbs, which make them way more available than before, which have actually decreased the price on average of these Delirium orbs, which is pretty pog. 40 or 60 splinters per map is obviously the price of the deli orbs by itself, right? So what's really cool about the strategy is that essentially the splinters, the simulacrum splinters that you're dropping from the map alone and mostly from the bosses, pays for the entirety of the price of the investment in the process. Every single thing that you are going to invest in the strategy, meaning basically just the delirium orbs and the alch and the chisels and the sextants, all of that, the entire thing is covered by the splinters alone, which is insane. All right, next, this is what we are interested in. You are going to get, on average, 1 unique cluster every 3 maps from the bosses, or every 5 to 6 bosses. So there's about a 15 to 20% drop chance to get a unique cluster. So if we go with, let's just say, round it up and say 20% chance to drop a cluster jewel, that means that every 5 bosses, or about every 3 maps on average, depending if you're going 40 or 60%, you're going to get 1 cluster, which on average is worth about 50C, which means that per map, right, per map, you're getting about 15C worth of value from just the unique cluster jewels by themselves. That alone also pays for the entirety of the investment in the maps, even if you weren't dropping the splinters by themselves, right? Even if they didn't exist, you would still be making profit from just the unique clusters. The Delirium actual rewards from, having Delirium on your map itself, and of course from those random Delirium orbs, from also when it does proc Compulsive Hoarder, from Pathological Liar, giving you maps of in areas have a 5% chance of layers of Delirium, right? All of these things are all completely free. And even the worst Delirium orbs possible still add a ton of quantity to your map. So you pair that up with some nice little sextants, right? Some quantity on your map. All can go, doesn't even matter. You're going to be dropping a ton of 6 sockets, in random currency drops. It's all 100% free. Clusters can be 1 to 5 for vendor recipe. Now, this is a recipe that is very important to know. You can actually 1 to 5 vendor recipe clusters, be medium or large. All that it requires is they all have the same rarity. So, all rare or all magic or whatever. I don't think it works with the white ones. So let's just say that you have 5 random medium clusters with 6 notables, which is something nobody ever wants. You can vendor all 5 to get a new random medium cluster jewel of the lowest item level of the bunch, but it does have a chance to be a good one. It could be fire damage, could be chaos damage, whatever it is, and it could be 4 or 5 passives, which is a little bit of a, I guess you could say, like nice little bonus once in a while. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, T11s means that the clusters are going to be item level 78 minimum, which means that you're past the threshold of 75. Now the question becomes, do you want to do 40% or 60%? The short answer is that you should always do 60% if your character is capable of running it at the exact same speed as 40%. That's pretty much the bottom line. That being said, if you're struggling with 60% and you're cruising through 40%, this is probably going to be a lot better because while it's less efficient time-wise, if you run the maps faster, it's actually going to be more efficient in the long run. But if we look at the value of 40% Delirium, for every 60 orbs invested, at 40% Delirium, you're going to get 30 maps worth, right? Because 2 orbs per map, which is on average 48 bosses, 960 splinters from the bosses alone, which is over 3 simulacrums fully, and 9 free Delirium orbs via Compulsive Hoarder, right? 9 free orbs. If you are running them at 60%, for 60% Delirium, you're going to run 20 maps only, right? Because there's an increase of 50% Delirium orbs used, 2 versus 3. You're going to get only 40 bosses because you're running 50% less maps. You're going to get 800 splinters from those bosses and only 6 Delirium orbs rewards via Compulsive Hoarder. So if you look at it this way, technically 60% is worse in every way, shape, or form when it comes to only this. You're going to get less bosses, less splinters because of less bosses, because of less maps. Now, of course, this doesn't account for the fact that In a higher Delirium map, the regular monsters are also going to drop more splinters, but that is very, very barely noticeable unless you're absolutely juicing your map, which you're not doing here, right? We're running Alk and Go, literally, putting nothing on these maps. It's all about the unique cluster jewel farming, which means more bosses is better. That being said, of course, if you're running them at the same time, 60% is always going to be better, because obviously you're going to get more out of each of the map. It's a multiplicative, basically, rewards, right? The more percent dilly you have. So 60% is 50% more rewards than 40% is. So it's always going to be better. That being said, again, it all comes down to how your character is doing in the maps themselves. Now, again, huge thanks to Fyregrass for helping me do this math. I'm super, super excited for this strategy going forward, if it's available in the upcoming Atlas. Now, for the people who are always going to ask me what build can run the strategy, the cool thing about this is that basically every single meta build in every single league is going to be able to do 40% Delirium T11s on an extremely small budget. I'm talking Tabula and some random rares. No problem. Fyregrass was testing with Lightning Strike Raider with Rebuke of the Val, the 1 Chaos Sword or whatever. It was doing extremely well. I tested it with my Fireball Miner for my League Starter. It does extremely well. Pretty much any of the builds that you see here, Ice Trap, Toxic Rain, Specters, Caustic Arrow, Spectral Shield Throw, be it Raider or Gladiator, Forbidden Rites, Freezing Pulse Totems, all of these can do these maps because, like I said, a 40% Delirious T11 is actually easier to do than a T16 regular map, which means it doesn't require a whole lot. For a meta build, it's going to be cruising through. Even the bosses are going to be absolutely annihilated. So again, really, really happy about how this strategy turned out and how this test turned out. It's one that I'm actually potentially even considering if bossing is not in a great state in 3.16. As we have seen right now, bossing in this state of the game is absolutely atrocious. Feared is less than 3x an hour when it's supposed to be the hardest content in the game. So it's not in a good spot. The drop rates of a lot of these things like Bottled Faith is literally ran through the ground. There's going to be a big meta shift, I think, when it comes to bossing in 3.16. And if the patch notes don't reassure me that bossing is going to be good, I think that this is going to be my go-to strategy. Now, before I go, I want to say a huge thank you to my supporters: Kat, Alex, Brandon, Nate, Alex, the other Alex, I should say, Flame Scorpion, Nearoth, Grimoire, the Great Master, Johnny Thomas, Reese, Tim, Axel, Road to Millions, Atticus, Scott, Stan, Hirashi, Welcome Back, Wolverine, Ronald, Kevin, the other Alex, Bitizen, and Mercury, as well as, of course, anybody else who has supported me in the past or who wishes to remain anonymous. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.